So tonight I want to focus really on the spiritual aspect of healing. And when I was researching the information for the book, the thing that I think excited me the most is I found two secular studies that actually referred to the fact that the only children that seemed to fully heal from war were children that were religious. And when I started looking at what those secular researchers considered religious, to me, Christianity was the only one that kind of checked all of those boxes. And that just fascinated me because we know that Jesus is the great physician. We talk about it, but to actually see it like practically applied in such an interesting way, I don't know. It's just been fascinating. And it's been interesting because I think any kind of trauma makes people have spiritual questions. And the questions they have, I think, differ in to some extent by where they are in their faith journey. So I will see people maybe that were, especially like in Ukraine, where they're raised Orthodox, where they think they're Christian, but they really not have been taught much Bible at all. Especially because if they're older and they grew up under Russia, where it was more like propaganda than it was scripture taught in their churches. And so they don't really have any spiritual background. So they come in with lots of questions about like, who is God and can he help me with all these bad things that are happening to me, how I'm feeling about all these bad things. And I think that's why, I mean, you know this as well as I do, that they're having so many conversions in Ukraine right now, because I think that they know that that's going to be the only answer for them. If they're going to heal from all of this trauma, that's the ultimate for them. Christians, it's interesting because they know that intellectually, and they're holding on to that emotionally, but then they struggle with what I would call the bigger faith questions like forgiveness. And that's really interesting because I have seen super, super, super strong Christians that I knew before the war really struggle with things that I would not have thought would have floored them so much. And it's not that I don't understand that it's flooring them. It's just, it always still surprises me from certain people because their faith seems so strong. And then they'll say these things and I'll kind of go like, oh, wow, I didn't expect to hear that from you. So it took me like a good year really to adjust and kind of find what so far has worked fairly well in having these harder conversations with the adults. But I wanted to start with the children because that's a little more fun and a little easier than with the grownups. So I want to introduce, it's kind of new, I think, in the Church of Christ. Honestly, I think it's new. I kind of found out about godly play by accident. My daughter had an chaplaincy internship in Texas one summer with the Church of Christ. And when I was writing the Ministering to Marginalized Children, I wanted to do a chapter on working with children who are chronically ill or terminally ill. And she suggested a few books. And so Godly Play was one that was mentioned in some of the books she had suggested. And so I started looking into it. And basically, Godly Play was invented back in the 1970s in Italy, oddly enough, by a guy named Jerome Berryman and a woman named Sofia Cavalletti. And I'm probably slaughtering those names. But it was basically a combination of some Montessori principles and faith. I generally tell people I think there are a couple of books out there about godly play, and I bought them both. Honestly, did not find them extremely helpful, only because, and I honestly don't know the denomination. I don't know if they were Catholic in Italy, they may have been, or Presbyterian, but they were definitely high church. Whoever invented it was high church. So when you look at the prepared scripts that you can buy and the things like that, it's got a lot of liturgy that we don't use that kind of makes them useless to us in some ways. And so it kind of broke it down so that we can write our own scripts. The other thing I would caution too is if you go onto their website, they charge a fortune for what they call godly play sets. And I just kind of piecemealed mine together for a fraction of that. So what you can do is I just happen to have a basket in my house. I don't know if you can see that. It's just like a huge basket, but you could use anything. You could use a picnic basket or whatever. And I just started gathering things. And the two things I was gathering were things that I could use for Bible era stories and things I could use for modern era stories. So there's basically, I guess if you want to break it down, there's like 3 or 4 general types of godly place stories. So you have them based on Bible stories. You have them based on like biblical types of themes, or not even really biblical, but you want to work Bible into them, obviously. And then you have them more like modern day, which kind of overlaps with the themes a little bit, but modern day issues like friendship or fear or whatever. And then parables is a big one that they use a lot too in godly play. So basically what you want in your play set is you want something like lengths of fabric that are, a decent size for a play mat, just a couple of feet or whatever, depending on how many children you want to do it with. Now, playing around with it, personally, I would not like to do it with more than 1 or 2 children at a time, just because of the way it's structured. They say you can do it with 4 kids per play set, but it's just kids today are used to so many things changing so quickly that I think it makes it too slow if you have too many children, because of the way it's done. So I have like green fabric in mine. I have blue fabric for stories that have water in them. And then I have all kinds of figurines. So the way you start, let's say I'm going to do a Bible story. So ahead of time, you read the Bible story in several kind of versions, and you kind of write it out. I mean, as bare bones simply as you can write it out. And then you have to kind of know how well your child that you're working with knows the Bible. So it was really interesting. I was showing this to a conference the other week. And a teenager walked into the room after I was done. He was playing around with my godly playset. And he goes, "Oh, well, this is Abraham for sure," because like he was literally like immediately knowing who these people in the Bible were, which they were just random Bible people, really. And so it was kind of interesting to see how quickly, and he was a teenager, but so they kind of do it. So anyway, if I were doing a Bible story, I would have my basket. And I would have pulled out the modern stuff. So I would just have all my Bible stuff in it. So I have people, I have like animals, depending on, whatever. I'll have things like palm trees. This is a stable, not very accurate, actually, historically. But anyway, if you could have a little play, houses from that time period. You can have, like, I just use these little wooden things with the holes in them and little sticks so that you can make a fence or whatever with it. If you want to spend a lot of time on it, get the kid really involved, you can just have Legos and have them make it. So what you do is you start out like, you know what? I thought it would be fun today to talk about the story of that Jesus told about the lost sheep. So what do you think? I wonder what we need in our story, and what can we use for the background of the backdrop or the bottom of our story, and then have the kid pull out the fabric or the whatever you've got and put it down. I wonder what people were in that story, and then they would pull it out. I wonder, what animals or whatever. And so you just get everything is I wonder. Now, if it's a child that doesn't know the Bible story, you could say, so this Bible story says that Jesus was telling a story. Now, I wonder who we could use to represent Jesus, and then let them pick it out that way. So you guide the story a little bit more if they don't know the story. And if they know the story fairly well, then you can say, well, I wonder what else we need for our story, and let them pull it out. And then you guide the conversation from the story to more of what are we supposed to learn from the story. So I wonder why Jesus told this story. And then you let them say whatever they're going to say, well, I wonder why that, blah, blah, blah. And of course, how you move that part of the conversation is how close to accurate they are with what they answer. You know what I mean? So if they're way off base, you're going to have to guide them a little bit more, saying, oh, that's really interesting, but I wonder if he maybe meant something else, or whatever, to kind of guide them. And so you want them to do that. Now, in theory, this was developed to be used with kids, like I said, who were chronically or terminally ill, who, for the most part, were afraid to talk to their parents about what was happening to them because they knew their parents were already really upset and they didn't want to upset them more. And so these hospital chaplains would come into the room when the parent was out of town, or not out of town, but like out of the room, and want to have these deep conversations with these children, but these children didn't know them. And so this was kind of a way to break the ice and get them talking. So they're big, in addition to the stories, on theme. So, like, I wonder what this little boy feels like, or what, something more modern, which would, I wonder who's in this family. And then you have like these little modern things I found. And I don't even worry about the scale, honestly, because kids are so imaginative. I don't, I try to keep them within a range, like they're not huge giants or whatever, but just because it's easier to cart around. But like, this is my modern house, quote unquote, and this is my modern person. So it's not obviously to scale, but I don't really sweat it too much. Also, I found at Hobby Lobby used to have these. I'm so upset they don't carry all the religious stuff anymore. But if you can find these little finger puppets, they have a lot of Bible finger puppets. Finger puppets also work well because they can either spread them out or they can put their fingers in and like, I wonder what, whatever. So those also work real well for that godly play set. Let's see. So you've got the modern ones, you've got the Bible stories. When you do a parable, to me, parables are my favorite ones to do with this, just because they lend themselves so well to this kind of thing, because they usually have animals and, certain things in them. And so what you can do for that is really direct it more, because kids don't tend to know as parables as well. So you can start like, I wonder what this pearl, mustard seed, or whatever could represent. I wonder what God wants you to learn from this parable. I wonder if there's something God wants you to do after hearing this parable, that kind of thing. If you're doing a theme, it doesn't necessarily have to go with the story, but I would definitely pull a few verses out that you could refer to when you're wondering. And asking questions like, I wonder what God thinks about whatever your theme is, friendship or being afraid or whatever. I wonder what this verse teaches us about what the theme is. I wonder what the theme would look like today. What questions you have about the theme. Wonder what you've learned that you did not know before, had forgotten, that kind of thing. And then one thing I tell people, and I think I mentioned this before with art and puppetry and stuff like that, if you're dealing with something specific like war or like a sibling that died, I don't know that I would address it head on. Mm-hmm. I would come at it from the side, from a theme of, I wonder what God thinks about when he sees that we're sad, that kind of thing. Kind of come at it from an angle. And then if they want to talk about it, that gives them an opening. But if they don't, they can skirt around it. I just don't like feeling like a child is being pressured to talk about something they may not be ready to talk about yet, especially if they don't know you well. I just think that they've already got enough pressure on them, and they don't need, like if you go into a child that's chronically ill or dying, you don't want to say, let's talk about you dying. What does it feel?
Right. Yeah.
They want to talk about it, that's great, but I'm surely not going to come in there and like head it straight on. Mm-hmm. I might talk about fear or, sadness or whatever, but I'm not going to say, well, how do you feel about the fact that you're dying now? It just doesn't seem respectful of letting them control the situation. Any questions about any of that?
I did have a comment. there is a lot of our curriculum is built on a writer, Alan Wolfelt,
Uh-huh.
and he did say that children don't grieve on a set schedule. They kind of grieve in their own time, and it's really important. They kind of grieve, play, grieve, play. It kind of switches on and off, and so it's
Yeah. In fact, we
really
were going to talk about that a little bit later, but I'll go ahead and mention that now since you're talking about that. You're right. Children do grieve, excuse me, very differently than adults do. And it tends to throw adults, and sometimes the children themselves for a little bit of a loop. Um, and because of that very thing. So personally, I think it's a healthy thing, but it's just an age thing. So adults, they said, generally at a major loss of a person, they grieve solid for about a year, give or take. I'm sure, depending on who the person is, how close they were, that kind of thing. Children, though, like you said, go in and out of the grief quite a bit, and so it throws parents, particularly off, because the kid will just be like despondent, and then 5 minutes later they're playing like nothing's wrong, and the parents like, oh, okay, I guess they're okay, I guess they're fine, and then it could be an hour later they're despondent again, or it could be day to day or week to week, and it just um, really confuses parents, especially if they're grieving the same thing and they're staying in that. They're like, oh, well, they must be very immature, or they must not understand it, or whatever. But it's just the way children are built. They're going to cycle in and out of it. The other thing that applies actually more to you really than it does normally to war is that different ages process death in different ways, which makes sense. The thing to watch for when you look at that chart, obviously for the very small children, they don't really understand what it means. They may think the person's asleep or gone away, or whatever. The problem with the charts that you see on how children grieve at different, or how children understand death at different ages, is it's taken from a secular perspective.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't make sense really to us as Christians. So, like, I know when our daughter was, how old was she? She was probably 5 or so. She had a great aunt that died that she was really close to, an older woman. And I was very adamant that she not see the dead body, because we had told her that the woman had gone to heaven and was with God. And I knew she was too young. If she saw the body, it would not make sense to her. You know what I'm saying? Like, wait, you said she was in heaven, but she's right here. I don't understand. Because she was just
Mhm.
too little to really understand the concept of a soul and the body and all this kind of stuff. And so my husband thought I lost my mind. But I was like, no, she can't see the body. It's like, no,
Mhm.
no, no, she will not, she's not going to be allowed to do that, because I don't want her to be confused spiritually after we've
Mhm.
told her that Aunt Pauline is in heaven. I don't want her seeing that body. But if she had been older, granted, I'm not a fan of seeing bodies, period, just personally, that's how I am. But um, it would have been different, because she could have understood that.
Mhm.
But when you look up the charts of the secular people, right, it's like, oh, at a certain age, they know they're gone forever and they'll never be seen again. You know what I mean? It's very final, there's no talk of heaven and souls and spirits and stuff. And so it's almost like they make it seem immature if you think that there is a spirit. They don't come out and say it, but it's
Mhm.
kind of like, oh, well, you're obviously immature if you don't understand that person's gone forever and will never be seen again. You know what I mean? That kind of
Mhm.
thing. So that caution people when you look at those things are not really particularly helpful to
Mhm.
Christians, I think, because we have a
Mhm.
whole different perspective on life and death and
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. So just be aware of that. But the other thing that they said that kids do a lot is they'll tend to just go up to random people and tell this kind of the same story of like, oh, my brother died. Oh, my brother died. Oh, my brother died. Or, whatever they're upset about. And they said they do that because they want to gauge how upset they should be by the reactions of the people they say it to.
Hmm.
So, that might be an extreme because, of course, they're going to be upset if a sibling dies. But, maybe it's a cat or an aunt or, something else that they're just not quite sure how upset they should be. And they said it's very common for especially younger children to just kind of say it matter of factly, like, oh, my Aunt Mary died. Oh, my Aunt Mary died, just to whomever, like it, like I had cereal for breakfast kind of attitude. But it's not that um, they're not upset or they don't care. It's just they don't know how to feel. And so they're trying to gauge how upset they should be by how other people respond to them. Um, let's see what else. The grieving. Let's see. Um, as with war, they may play games reenacting the loss, especially if it's something they saw. Like if they saw somebody drown or be in a car wreck or something. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it can. And then also asking the same questions over and over, like, asking everybody, where do you think heaven is? Or um, do you think, grandpa can see me or whatever their questions are. They may ask them multiple times, either to the same person or to different people. And once again, it's just they're trying to process what's going on in their own way. Um, the other thing to remember, especially with, I'd say anybody under the age of 18, and really all of us to an extent, it just seems more dramatic in children and teenagers because they tend to be more dramatic sometimes, is that they can mourn what seems to us like a not as important loss as badly as what we would consider an important one. So I think I gave us an example early on. Early in the war, I was in Poland and we were talking about this. And one of the families came out and was like, oh, I'm so glad you said that because our kid has just been devastated that he had to leave his guitar behind. Like it's just the most crushing thing, more so than other things, like, and so, but, I told them, I said, well, but to him, that is as important. So the fact that they missed the school play because they had to go to the funeral, they may appear to be mourning that more than they do the person that they went to the funeral for. And it's just, with children, you kind of have to be respectful of where they are emotionally, even if it's not realistic from an adult perspective, if that makes sense. So you may know the kid can get another guitar. It's not that big of a deal in the scheme of things. And he did eventually get another guitar. But you have to understand in that moment for that child, that's devastating. That's just as devastating as any other loss to that child. And you have to treat that child with the same respect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because sometimes adults tend to be, and I don't think they mean to be this way, but I think sometimes they're very demeaning to children. It's like, oh, that's nothing, or that's not a big deal, or you'll learn that that's nothing in the scheme of things when you get older, stuff like that, which is not helpful in a situation. Because the truth is, your child is devastated for whatever reason. They need to be comforted. They don't need to be felt like they're being mocked or anything like that when they're mourning. Okay, anything else on mourning? And they didn't really give an ultimate time frame for the children. They just said they would cycle in and out until they had processed it. They didn't say whether it lasted as long as a year, like the adults did or not. In the material I read, now they may be somewhere, but I didn't see anything specific amount of time. The other thing to remember too, like I saw this a lot with refugees from the war, is because the kids cycle in and out when they're having a good day and they're playing and laughing and giggling, then the parent thinks, okay, they're all better now. And that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just important to kind of remind people, like, to keep an eye on it. And like we said early on, just to remember every few years, they're going to have to process all of it again as they get more intellectual tools, abstract thinking, and things like that. They'll have to
Mm-hmm.
go back and process things. It's why often you will see kids that were adopted, even from birth, like go off the rails when they hit adolescence. And people think like, oh, it's the hormones, which I'm sure the hormones don't hurt anything. But a lot of it's because that's the age when they start being abstract thinkers, and they don't even necessarily are not cognitively necessarily aware of it, but they're starting to question like, why was I abandoned? Why was I put up for adoption? Why?
Mm-hmm.
When they were younger, it's just kind of concrete. It was what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start spiraling, and
Mm-hmm.
parents like, what just happened? My kid was fine and now they're spiraling. Well, it's the same thing with any kind of trauma. They will seem to heal, and sometimes they will if it's not a huge trauma. But if it's something huge, like these kids that are going through this war of, for months and years at a time, they're going to have to readdress it probably again multiple times as they get older
Yeah.
to really get through it. Um, and that's just the way it is. So, and I think we talked about earlier too, the elder that went with us over there, who was a U.S. soldier for PTSD from the Gulf War. He even said, make sure when people feel like they have processed their way through trauma and feel like they have healed, just to gently remind them that anniversaries, holidays, seeing something that reminds you of that person or that event can trigger and bring back all those feelings you thought you'd processed. But they need to know that since they were able to process them the first time, it's going to be quicker and easier the second time because they have the tools to do it now. And they just have to do the work again, and not to feel like somehow something's wrong with them or they failed somehow to heal. It's just natural that triggers will bring up memories, and memories can bring up feelings with them. And that's normal. Okay, let's talk about some of the big questions that teenagers have, especially older children that are more mature or more sensitive can also have some of these same issues. And a lot of these are the reasons why the secular people believe that the spiritual or Christian or religious, however you want to put it, children heal, because they don't feel secularism really addresses these adequately. So the first is the loss of hope, which makes sense, depending on the trauma, obviously, once again, but something that seems like it goes on forever, or it seems like it's multiplying. I know we have a sweet lady at our church right now whose husband has stage 3 pancreatic cancer, and then her sister just died, dropped dead, like in her, 40s or whatever. So, sometimes with some people, life is just like that. It's like you're reeling, like just one thing after another seems to hit, and it's horrible. Those kind of people are going to struggle with loss of hope more than just something that's like a one-shot deal. And that was the number one thing that they said that made the difference between spiritual people and people who were not. Because people who were not, their hope has to be based on circumstances. So they can't honestly have hope in the future unless they honestly believe the future is going to get better. And it's not always going to get better here on this earth. And so then they find out they've been lied to, or you know what I mean? And it's just not a good scenario. Versus faith, our hope is not in our circumstances. Our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is in God. Our hope is in heaven. Those things are concrete. Those things never change. Those things aren't going to ever let us down. And so that lets us recover our hope more quickly when we're reminded of those things. The sign to watch for between the difference between hope and loss of hope is, they say, the making of the plans for the future, dreams for the future, plans for the future. If they're talking about, oh, I can't wait till this is over and I feel better and I do this, or, I'm looking forward to a year from now when it doesn't hurt as much. Any kind of sign of looking towards the future. And they, honestly, we were talking about the suicide class last semester that I had. That was one of the things they pointed to. People that have hope for the future are much less likely to commit suicide or become suicidal. It's when they can't seem to find hope in any way that they're most in danger. So that's that's a critical one because it's definitely a separation between the spiritual and the non-spiritual people, but then also it's a separation between being heading towards healing and perhaps becoming suicidal. So it's just one to really keep an eye on, and just continually trying to remind people and point out where their hope should really exist, and it can't be on circumstances. Um, we suggest that, of course, Ecclesiastes is a good book to talk about those kinds of feelings with, encouraging people to look forward to something. What's something that you can look forward to? You know, let's plan to get together and go somewhere fun for lunch. And you don't have to use the word fun, obviously, if it's disrespectful at that point. But you know what I'm saying? Try to help them look forward to something with you or on their own or whatever. You just have to kind of manage that depending on the circumstance. The next thing, and this I think is definitely more of a war thing, maybe than just trauma in general, but I do think it also comes up in urban ministry and some other situations, is this loss of meaning and purpose. That going back to the woman at our church, it was really interesting. Somebody was talking to her recently, and it was like, how are you getting through this, whatever. And she had decided, for whatever reason, and I didn't hear what her reasoning was, that I can guess, but she had decided that one of the things that she was going to do, because of course all of her time is spent ministering to her spouse and her child, and you know, now her family with her sibling dying, she felt like she wasn't, maybe, and I don't, this is not the right way to put it necessarily, she felt like she maybe wasn't serving God the way she had in the past. She was so focused on her world at that point. And so she was in danger of maybe losing that feeling of meaning and purpose for her life, other than being a caretaker. And so what she had decided to do was go online on Facebook every day and post an encouraging verse from the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of God's prizes, to be like an outreach to other people who maybe were struggling or whatever. And that gave her that meaning and purpose. And honestly, I think I talked about with this teenagers, serving other people, I think, is one of the healthiest things that you can get people that are doing. It just gets you outside of yourself, even if it's just for a little bit. You know, even if it's kind of like taking an emotional break. Like, I'm sure you've seen before, sometimes people suggest, you know, like you let yourself cry for an hour every morning, every night, and then you try not to think about it or whatever. I think this is almost a healthier way of doing it. It's like, okay, I understand that this is going to go on for some time and you're going to feel this way for some time, but what can we do positive? I had a friend that had a child that had a very, very severe form of cerebral palsy, and he passed in his 30s. And obviously she knew it was coming at some point, that he would not live a full life, but obviously very upset. But one of the things that comforted her over time was finding people that couldn't afford the expensive wheelchair that he had and giving it to them. You know what I mean? Giving his things that they can no longer use to people that needed them, that maybe couldn't afford them. Supporting other families that have special needs children, those kinds of things. You know, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving that had the child killed, I think, in a drunk driving accident, starting that. So trying to help them find some way to find meaning and purpose, not necessarily in what happened. I don't think necessarily that's what you're going for, but just in their own life, that they can still make a difference, that they still have a purpose here on earth, because I think it's tied in with that hope. I don't have any hope while I'm even here. Maybe I should just end it all. Well, you have hope because there's God, and also because God has good works planned for you that he still wants you to do. And let's start moving towards that. So, but a lot of this stuff is just a gut feel. You kind of put it out there, see how they react, and then just react based on that, if that makes sense. Addressing shifts in right and wrong. I used to think this was mainly for kids and teens, and still I started talking to some adults. And I'm sure you've had these same conversations with people who have a lot of anger and rage and bitterness about whatever happened and say things that I don't think that they normally would have said. And if they were hearing themselves say them, they would be appalled. If you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like, oh, I just,
Yep.
that person's a giant. I should kill that person. And you're
Mhm.
like, wait, what? Did you just say? Did you hear what you just said?
Yeah.
That person should go straight to, whatever. So I think there is something about trauma that does tend to shift your ideas of right and wrong, just because you're not thinking with your brain as much as you're thinking with your heart and your emotions sometimes. And so, I mean, you and I have probably even had moments with Putin where we're just kind of like, I don't know about this. Now, we don't go that extreme, maybe, because it's not personal to us in that way. But um, I think that's part of it. But also, I think part of it, especially in a large scale trauma, like a natural disaster, like the wildfires in California, like the war, anything like that, um, there's a lot of exposure to a lot of ungodly people saying a lot of ungodly things as if it's a good thing to say.
Mhm.
And I mean, not to get political, because I try to avoid that at all costs, but just an example of this idea of destroying other people's vehicles because they were made by somebody that somebody doesn't like anymore. And this is a great thing and we should celebrate it. It's like, okay, I don't care what you feel about that other person that made the car. You're hurting some poor innocent person's,
Mhm.
property for they didn't like they could have had that car from 30 years and can't afford a new and you're going to tear like really, but that's what people are exposed to in these high emotional traumatic situations. People just say things and they get everybody all worked up and then people just get caught up in the moment. It's that's how revolutions start, honestly, or riots or anything like that. They just get everybody all worked up, and the next thing you know, you're caught up with everything else, and then you're suddenly doing things that a month ago you would have said were horrible and sinful, and you would never have done it. So it's just important to be aware that that happens. Maybe not as dramatically as that, but just listen to the things that they say and don't be afraid to go very gently, wait, what did you just say? you
Uh-huh.
know, really? Huh. Hmm. Interesting. Let's talk about
Yeah.
that for a minute. And I've had a
Right.
few of those conversations. And people
Uh-huh.
like, especially at the beginning, it's still not great, but sometimes people that you would never expect. I remember at the beginning having these conversations with people about how Jesus only said we should forgive other Christians. And I was like, what? Where are you even? You know what I mean? Like, the logic just gets kind of twisted.
Mhm.
Um, and so you just really have to watch for this thing. You have to be on top of your own scripture too.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I had to go back and look. I was like, I don't, and they because on the story of da 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 da, and I'm like, okay, that's not how I remember it. But then you have to go back and look at yourself. You're like, well, let me make sure that I'm not like misremembering it myself before I get into this, long, deep conversation. So, but just watch for that. Especially because, like I said, and in a situation like a war situation or something where people are really angry, or like a drunk driver has killed someone, or whatever. Um, there are a lot of people who said that person should die. We should just kill him. I just whatever. And you really have to like get on that stuff, which goes into the next one, addressing the anger and forgiveness. Um, and I struggle with this honestly for like the first year or so. Like I would kind of dip my toe in it, and then people would give me these looks, and I would be like, they're gonna throw things at me. I need to back off. Now
Mhm.
I've just gotten pretty bold and brazen.
Mhm.
And I think it's just because over time I feel more confident in how I approach it. And so it's not that their responses are any more positive than they ever were, but I feel more passionate that it's an important conversation to have, because I feel like the more you let anger and unforgiveness take root, the harder it's going to be to root out in the end. And I really feel very strongly that the scriptures, that God isn't kidding when he says we have to forgive. um, because it's just said so sternly and so many times. And so we have to help people root this out as quickly as we possibly can so that it doesn't take root and it doesn't feel impossible for them, even though it does, even in the beginning to them, but it's not as hard as it will be later. So, what I have found works the best, granted, still upsets people, but some people, but I think most people get it intellectually, even though I'm not emotionally ready for that, is the first thing I have to do is admit that there is no way I know what they're feeling like. I don't care if I've been through something very similar. Everybody is different. And I think the first wall that goes up is when you say, well, I know how it must feel. No, you don't. You know, even if you've been through something exactly the same, it's got different aspects to it. And so I think that's like one of the most hurtful and sometimes insulting things you can say. So I always start out with like, look, I'll be honest. I have no idea how you really feel or how it feels to be going through the losses you've suffered. And I honestly don't know how I would react, because that's the other thing too. We'd like to think we wouldn't do that, but given that if we were in the same situation, we don't know. We could be exactly the same. You know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
so if some drunk driver killed our kid, who knows how we would go off? You know, we'd like to think we wouldn't, but we don't really know. So I always try to say, look, and I honestly, I don't know how I would react if I were in your situation. I'd like to think, you know, but I don't know. And then that kind of lowers their defenses because you're giving them the benefit of a doubt almost. And but then I say, but here's what I know as a Christian is that God says we have to forgive and he doesn't put caveats on it. And then I go into, but let me explain to you what forgiveness is and forgiveness is not. And forgiveness is not saying it is okay what that person did to you. It's not saying it's great that they did it, because that's what people think on some level. But it is saying that you trust God enough that you are going to let God handle it, whatever that looks like. You are not going to get revenge. You are not going to feel like you have to turn that person around and get them to ask for your forgiveness or whatever. Because the truth is, in most cases, especially, you know, in a criminal case, in a case of, you know, a disease, like, you know, there's not even really a person to be mad at specifically, or a Putin situation or whatever. Truth is, with those people, Putin couldn't care less whether they forgive him or not. And there is no way he is ever on this planet, barring a miracle of God, going to go to those people and apologize, sincerely apologize and try to make it right. And so what they are doing by not forgiving Putin is they are destroying their own bodies, their own souls, their own spirits, their children, their spouses, their friends, as this anger turns into bitterness and rage. And they become these people they don't even recognize anymore. And honestly, they become the person that they're upset with in a lot of ways. And so, but then I tell them, I was like, this is not going to be easy. I am not trying to make you think that you're just going to go, oh, I forgive you, and it's all going to be roses, because it's not. It may be the hardest thing you ever do. It may be something you work on for the next 20 years or for the rest of your life. I don't know. But I just know it's something you have got to figure out a way to do, is to let this go and let God handle dealing with that person or that situation, and trust God that he will make it just or fair or whatever you're looking for. The other thing that I try to get into people with is that part of the way to forgive is to not let yourself think about it all of the time. I feel like, and I think there are some studies that would back this up. I feel like that just feeds your anger and feeds your rage and feeds your unforgiveness. And if you think about it, if you've ever had something happen to you that just annoyed you, and you're just like, I just got to tell somebody about it. But then the more people you tell about it, it's almost like it grows in your mind and it gets harder and harder to let it go. And so you have to try to help them break that cycle. And then just say, thinking about that same incident over and over again, or that same group of incidents or whatever, constantly, every day, all day long, is not healthy. It's not going to change anything with that person because you're not having conversations with that person. All it's doing is eating you up. It's destroying your health. And there's statistics on this. You can tell them how it's going to destroy their physical health, heart disease, cancer, all that stuff comes from anger and rage, strokes, psychological issues, depression, whatever. Their children are just, ruined if they just are nothing but a ball of anger and rage all the time. And so that seems to resonate with them more than anything. It's just saying, don't let yourself constantly think about it. It happened. It was horrible. It was awful, but you can't constantly think about that the rest of your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if it's a situation like a PTSD situation, then they're going to need to get professional help, I think, to be able to do that for sure. But when it's just a situation where it's a flat out anger, I'm not forgiving this person kind of situation, then that's something that they've got to work on, obviously. And just say, there are going to be things that trigger this in you. And you've got to remind yourself, I'm not going to think about this. I'm going to think about something else. I'm going to do something positive to help somebody else. I'm going to read scripture. I'm going to pray. I'm going to watch something that makes me laugh. I'm going to go take a walk. Like, I'm going to do something other than continually obsess about this incident over and over and over and over. And I think I mentioned early on, those were the people in the one country that did not seem to be doing well, that were heading towards clinical depression, were in a situation where the people trying to help them let them continually talk about the same incident over and over again. And I think that's what was happening at the end of the day. And I mean, sometimes everybody will look, depending on what the situation is, but like in the war situation, I'm sure it's the same if someone was murdered or killed in a drunk driving accident or anything like that. People will give you the funniest looks, but if they're Christians, they've heard it. This is not something they don't know internally themselves. They just don't want to be reminded of it. Most of them, and I'll be honest, I'll say, I know you're not ready to have this conversation right now. I know you're not ready. You don't think you're ready to even begin this process. But I feel like I need to tell you because I don't know if I'll see you again. And also I need to tell you because the longer you wait to start the process, the harder it's going to be. And so you need to try to start now, even though it feels impossible, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. And some people just flat out get mad. And they'll go back and talk to other people. Like, I can't believe she said to do that. How does she think I can ever forgive? That's okay. Just make sure you've got people that they're talking to that'll have your back and reinforce what you're saying. Because it's something, they've just got to address it. As horrible as it is and as possible as it feels, you just have to be empathetic and just say, like, dude, I can't imagine. I know it's got to feel like this isn't possible. This is horrible. I can't imagine how hard this is. All I know is this is what God commands. And he does that because that's what's best for you, emotionally, physically, spiritually, everybody around you. I don't know what to say, but I've had that conversation way more than I care to, and get ready to go have it again with a bunch of new people. So looking forward to that one again. But and it's funny, at that time you think those, and it's going to be interesting this year, particularly because I am going back to one location where somebody got really mad at me last year. And so it's going to be interesting to see if that person is still there and what they see during this year when I come in spouting the same thing. If they're there still, and if they'll say, you know, well, yeah, you're right, I'm working on it, or I still think you're crazy. But I think in the end,
Update
most of
us.
them, huh?
Update us when you come back. Let us know how that went.
Yeah, I'll let you know. I'll say, hey, you're not going to believe it, but I ran into that person that got so mad at me last year. But the funny thing was, that person got so angry. I mean, literally was in the back of the church, like chewing out somebody that was connected to the church, just blah, 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 blah. But then like 3 days later, I was in a refugee center, like loosely connected to the church, but not in the church. And that same person showed up and it was like, yeah, I was giving your book to all these people back in you. I'm like, were you not just like furious like 3 days ago? So I would be interested to see if he's back this year and what he says to me, but it was just kind of like, so I think they process it, whether it actually makes a difference. I don't know, but I feel like, do you know, have you ever heard of Orpheus Hayward? He's a Church of
No.
Christ preacher. He's a Church of Christ preacher here in Atlanta. He's really, really good. Probably one of the better preachers in the Brotherhood right now. And he is bold. Like he is seriously bold. He says things, and we visited his congregation sometimes. He's too far for us to go there all the time, but we'll visit sometimes and we're like, whoa, dude, I cannot believe he's like, he's
Wow.
true, but he is bold. Like he does not care. Like, and he cracks me up because he'll say things like, he has a very large secret population in his congregation. And he's just like, now, you may not want to hear this, but I am not about to go to heaven and tell God that I did not tell you that you needed to, you know, this thing that you needed to know, whatever. And so I tease him all the time. I was like, I try to channel you sometimes, but I have to be brave. And that's kind of how I feel about this anger and forgiveness thing, specifically the forgiveness part of it. Is it is hard. It's not fun. I don't like people being mad at me. I don't like people not liking me, but I don't want to go to heaven and God say, why didn't you tell that person they had to forgive? Because they would have been here if you'd been bolder. You know what I mean? So I just
Wow.
try to remind myself that. And just every time I get to this point, I just go, here we no one's
God
thrown
needs a
anything at
battering
me.
ram.
Huh?
I said, when God needs a battering ram, he brings me in.
Yeah, nobody's thrown anything at me yet, which I was afraid of in the beginning. But yeah, I've definitely made some people not too happy. But what are you gonna do? The other things that come up, and there's different ways to handle this, but obviously addressing trust, um, especially with young people, I feel like the rug can feel like it's pulled out from under them. Everything they thought they could trust, they can't anymore. And so it's just rebuilding that trust in their heads that God's still there. Their parents are, assuming their parents are still there, you know what I mean? That everything will kind of, that everything's not gone. But even adults, I think, can lose trust in God. Like I thought, and a lot of times that is because their theology is a little bit off. Like they've, what is that verse that everybody always misquotes? Is supposed to be God doesn't give you temptation that you can't handle without giving you a way out. But everybody says God doesn't give you any more than you can handle, which is not what the Bible says. That people believe that. And so I thought God could give me more than he can handle. How can I trust him? It's like, well, first of all, that's not in the Bible. Yeah. And you have to be really gentle. But I think with adults, a lot of times the loss of trust is more in God. Although that can also happen with young people too, because I have heard of young people that have questions when these kinds of things happen and adults don't address them. And that's the one thing I really would, especially with new Christians, especially with teenagers, especially with older children, ask them, what questions do you have about, you know, whatever, especially as it pertains to God, Christianity, faith, scripture, whatever. My husband and I started doing this years ago. We had a class of that somebody had kind of dared us to take because it was all these young kids are just out of control. And we went in there, and the first thing I did was every week I'm going to give you a little index card, and I want you to write down any questions you have about God, Jesus, Bible, whatever, whether it has to do anything with class or not. I just want you to write all your questions down so we can make sure we answer them. And these kids that everybody had come to, oh, they don't care about God, they don't care about church, they don't blah, blah, blah. They had some of the deepest, most heartbreaking spiritual questions I've ever seen in my life. And if we had not asked them to share those questions, I don't know that anybody would have ever known they had those questions nor addressed them. And when we don't address people's spiritual questions, the world, God, Satan will make sure the world does. And he'll make sure those questions are lies, or the answers are lies. And if they believe them, then that's when they fall away. So there have been so many people I've talked to over the years that, oh, I fell away because I had this, that, and the other question. Nobody could answer it. And so the world told me this and I believed it. And so I don't believe in God anymore. And I thought, that was such a simple question. If somebody had really taken the time to help them work through it. Now, the trauma questions are not as simple often, but I still think they're addressable, or as much as we can. We just got to make sure that we address them and we don't leave them up to a bunch of people Satan's put in their lives to tell them lies. Empathy becomes a thing, which there's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is feeling sorry for people. Empathy is like actually wanting to make a difference and feeling like you're in an equal footing. I don't think really Christians struggle with that maybe as much as non-Christians do, but that is something. For teenagers and kids, another thing that trauma can bring, especially if it's a lot, is this idea of locus of control and obedience. Especially the locus of control. They feel like everything is out of their control because it has been, honestly, for a time, whatever that time period is. And so depending on their personality, they can go either one of two extremes. They can feel like they have to like micromanage everything in their lives, almost to the point of being OCD, or they can go the opposite and get like a victim mentality where nothing I'm going to do is going to matter. No self-efficacy. And that is also a very dangerous mindset when they get that victim mentality, because that's when they become easy for predators to take advantage of, particularly. So watch for that. Guilt. This was really interesting to me, the idea of survivor guilt. I hadn't really thought about it a lot, but my guess is you're going to see this more in like young people maybe that were in a car wreck and somebody died, but they didn't. Or maybe they were supposed to be in the car, but then they weren't. Or they were, you know what I'm saying? That kind of thing where it was a close miss in their heads. Or maybe it wasn't even a close miss. Maybe for some reason they thought it should have been them instead of their friend. Maybe they think their friend was a better person or, whatever. I thought it was very interesting because the studies show that people with survivor guilt can actually self-sabotage their own lives, as in some kind of way to like make it fair again or something. Like they feel like it, and they probably don't even like directly think this way, but they said you have to really watch people with survivor guilt because they were often the ones that will get into the drug and alcohol abuse or do other things that like derail their own life because they felt like they should not have lived on some level. So I don't know how common that is, but just kind of watch for that. They said it can also show up in people that thought that they could have somehow prevented the death. So I would imagine that's more common in people that like somebody committed suicide and they thought maybe if I just said something differently, they wouldn't have done it, or which that I can understand how you might feel that way. Not that it's accurate, but I can see where that's where your mind might go sometimes. The other thing, and I don't want to, okay, I'll run through these last few things, addressing joy and happiness. Young people especially will feel guilty that something's making them happy, especially if their parent is mourning longer than they are. And they just have to know it's okay and encourage the parents to let them know it's okay. or they'll try to hide it. And it's not healthy for them not to have positive feelings periodically. With teenagers, watch for having conversations about godly relationships. One of the ways that teens often act out after trauma is to sexually act out. So you really want to have a lot of conversations about how you find your comfort in other people, if that makes sense, and acceptable ways to do that. Addressing gratitude, which is another thing that they may struggle with. Well, I have nothing to be thankful for, which is not a great mindset to be in. And then, of course, the big question, which we don't usually have the answer for ourselves even, is why? Why did this happen? And I think when you drill down into everything, the end of the question is, we live in a fallen world and bad things happen and life isn't fair, but God's going to make it fair in the end when he comes back. And sometimes that's all you can say. And obviously, I mean, you guys know not to say God needed that person in heaven, or, all those kind of weird things that people can sometimes say, but you guys are better trained than I am and all that. So, here's the stage. I knew I had this somewhere. So the development of stages in mourning. I'm sorry, let me go back to that. So birth to 3 years, they are considered too immature to have any understanding of loss, particularly death. But they will notice the absence of someone if it's someone that's been in their life a lot. But that's all they notice is the absence. They don't connect any dots. 3 to 5 years, children tend to think of death as only being less alive or asleep, which is where I say the Christianity comes in, kind of making this a little bit fuzzier for us than it is for secular. 5 to 9, they understand the finality of death of a body, but think it only happens to other people. However, some children in this age group may seek reassurances that the death of someone they know is not somehow contagious and will result in the death of a parent or themselves. That's been more my experience, honestly. Our daughter, there was a mother of a child in her class who had breast cancer for a couple of years. And I just happened to, unfortunately, be at school the day that somehow word got back to the kids that she had passed. And they were freaking out. They were all just in a tizzy that something was going to happen to their mothers. And so in a way, it was kind of good I was there because the teacher was out of the room. So I could do the Christian thing a little bit more than she probably could have, and kind of reassure them and tell them to go talk to their moms, and their moms were fine and stuff. But that's been more of my experience. And then they said 10 years and beyond that they understand death kind of the same way adults do. But like I said, I think with us believing in there being an afterlife and in heaven and all that sort of thing, this is not quite as concrete. But I do find in that 5 to 9-year-old thing, they do think anything can be contagious and get very upset at times about that. Okay, so the signs of healing, things you want to look for in people that give you a sense that they're getting better. And if you don't see these things after a time, or that you see that they're getting worse, then that's the time you want to really start talking about them going to see a professional of some sort, whether that's a physician or a therapist or whatever. Having said that, I don't know if I shared this with you. I think I saw this after last time I talked to you guys. Who was I even reading this? A study found that 68% of people that do therapy are actually doing it very poorly, which is kind of scary when you think about it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So some of the signs that there's healing, there's a reduction in any previous trauma symptoms, whether those be physical, psychological, behavioral, or spiritual. Returning to age-appropriate behaviors, because I think we said that you tend to regress. Even adults can regress to an extent. So when they start coming back up to where they would be normally, then that's showing some healings happening. Showing a willingness to do things independently. This is more for children and teens. They tend to get very clingy. And so when they start exploring a new environment, those sorts of things, that's a good sign. Showing appropriate emotional responses for a given situation, neither overreacting or underreacting. Creating and maintaining healthy friendships. A lot of times, especially if they've been relocated, they haven't made good new friends, especially as teenagers, is tough anyway. But if they're settling into their new situation, that will come, and they'll close off sometimes to new people. But when they start going back to their friends, that helps. If they handle separation and reunions with parents or caregivers in age appropriate ways, handle temporary separations well, appear to have a healthy sense of self, exhibiting an age appropriate amount of self control, exhibiting fewer incidents of hypervigilance, and exhibiting a sense of relationship with God through prayer and Bible study. And hopefully their faith is recovering from any hits that it may have taken. Though those are signs that, like I said, that things are starting to trend. Also, of course, if you can see laughter and joy and stuff coming back at times, that's always a good sign too. You don't want them just staying stuck in sadness. If you go online, the book is online in English, Ukrainian, and Russian, and is about to go online in Spanish as soon as the new website launches. If you go in there, there is actually a chapter for children that goes through these same ideas, but more on their level, with activities attached, art activities and things like that you can do with them to reinforce these topics more on their age level.
Are you talking about Teach One, Reach One?
Yeah, if you go on the Teach One, Reach One website, go under ebooks, and this should stay the same even when the new website launches in a couple of weeks. I don't think those are going to change. Go under ebooks, and it's called Helping Children of War. It's the book that we've kind of been talking through. We've added some stuff to it, but most of it's in that book. And there's some things we didn't have a chance to get to. And one of them is this chapter with the children's Bible lessons that cover the same topics we just talked about, but it also has activities. And then also the chapter, it's the same chapter or chapter after that, but there's also a section that goes into ways to do like breathing exercises with kids and different things like that. Activity ideas to encourage process and healing. So chapter 12 and chapter 13 go into more specifics. And what I did in chapter 13 is I took things like the breathing exercises, but then I matched them to a story that they would work well as an activity for that story. Relaxation exercises, art activities. And so tied some ideas, musical activities, things like that to specific Bible stories so you can see how to work them into a children's Bible class if you wanted to do that in a way that didn't feel awkward or one off.